Welcome back to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. Thank you so much for your listenership. And today we're going to talk about exciting things, as we always do every week. One of my favorite authors, if not my favorite author. That varies day to day. But today, it's Dostoyevsky, because we're talking about him again. And why not, really? We've read Crime and Punishment. We're going to pulverize Brothers Karamazov and squeeze so much goodness out of that, you won't be able to believe it. And the reason for that is because there's material in there that will change your life. It is very, very good. Admittedly, a very slow book, but I read it for you, so you don't have to. Or you can, and you can enjoy it even more because you know what's going on and things like that. But anyway, today we're going to talk about really one of Dostoyevsky's most remarkable works that doesn't really see the light of day that often, unless you're running around in existentialist circles or you're looking for specific criticisms of socialism, or you just really love Dostoyevsky, and that is Notes from Underground. Even though you don't hear about it too much today, as opposed to his other novels, the influence was tremendous. I'd say the impact of Dostoyevsky's novels, in terms of magnitude, goes in the order that he wrote them. So his least powerful of his three most powerful books, Notes from Underground, was published in 1864, and then after that, you have Crime and Punishment in 1866, and then as his final work, he wrote Brothers Karamazov, and he said that it was the best thing that he had written, and most commentators and critics agree. Also very influential. Even Stalin read Brothers Karamazov and liked it a lot. I don't know what that says about it, but, just little random factoids that, of course, I know about Stalin, because that's just the kind of person that I am, apparently. Okay, so before we discuss more of Dostoyevsky's brilliant writings, I want to ask you that you would share your thoughts about the podcast in the form of a review on iTunes or on Facebook. That is so helpful for the podcast. I can't even put it in words, except that I can. It's very helpful for the podcast. So please do that. We're still a very young podcast, and displays of approval from listeners really goes a long way for algorithms and people who are interested, but they're skeptical, that kind of a thing. So if you've already done that, thank you so much. I always read those comments, and it really is a joy. And thank you to everyone who writes to me, too. Every now and then I'll get a little message from those contact forms on my website, and I really appreciate that. It's so nice to hear from listeners. You can actually find that at wellreadchristian.com if you're interested in writing to me. And then wellreadchristian.com actually has got some other cool goodies, too. You can find notable quotes in the episodes section, things that I was going to quote, but then didn't end up quoting. It didn't make it in the final script for whatever episode that I'm talking about. So you can find notable quotes there, and I have their references and everything, so you can save them for your own private records. There's also a blog and an about page and all sorts of things like that. You can get to know us a little more through there. And then, of course, we have our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages. Please subscribe to those, follow us, and all those great things. It'll take you about 30 seconds, and it's free, so it helps us out a lot. Okay, let's talk about Notes from Underground. Notes from Underground is often considered to be the first existentialist work ever. And the reason for that is because the main character expresses some of the absurdities of life, some of the absurdities of society and human existence and consciousness. And the main character has a profound reaction against determinism and scientism and really the modern worldview and where philosophy was in the 1900s, where people felt like Kant and some of those thinkers had kind of used their extractions to go so far that philosophy was no longer relevant. It was no longer meaningful. People like Kierkegaard were saying things like, look, I don't care about forms and what the difference between essence and being and like this is ridiculous. I want to talk about death. What is death? Death is absurd. Why is death in the universe? Why do I exist? And so that existentialism kind of turned a new leaf for the history of philosophy. But also other essential things about existentialism come up. So, for example, free will and whether the things that he does, the things that the main character does, are caused by external causes, or whether he's free to determine his own destiny. A lot of existentialist thinkers think it's very important that human beings view themselves as essentially free. And so the main character here in Notes from Underground is going to struggle with the human condition. There's an interesting thing about Notes from Underground too, as well as Crime and Punishment. It was carved up pretty bad by the censors. I actually have a quote for you from Dostoyevsky, who was writing a letter, I think it was to his brother, and he was complaining about the censorship. He said, quote, "The most important one where the essential thought is expressed, where I mocked at everything and sometimes even blasphemed for form's sake, that is let pass. But where from all this I deduced the need for faith in Christ, that is suppressed," end quote. And so he's saying there, he's like, look, when I make fun of Christianity or I mock things for the sake of artistic expression, that is let go, of course. But when I actually conclude in the end that faith in Christ is required for a logical existence or whatever Dostoevsky's argument was going to be, that they cut. And it's interesting because the same thing happened with Crime and Punishment too. But Dostoevsky never went back and replaced the cuts. And that's kind of a mystery why he didn't do that. Some critics have suggested that Dostoevsky simply didn't have the time, or maybe he didn't want to fight the censors, or some have even said that maybe it's because Dostoevsky recognized that the cuts were actually improvements on the work, and that the reader coming to their own conclusions about the necessity for faith in Christ on their own was more powerful than if Dostoevsky spells it all out. You know, it's kind of like him giving you the argument in premise 1 and premise 2 and then leaving the conclusion for you to discover on your own. What is absolutely certain, though, is that Dostoevsky's personal journal reveals that in his own philosophy, in the way he viewed the world, his worldview is what I was going to say, the need for faith in Jesus is a crucial conclusion and centerpiece of his work. It's not an ideological addition. It's not something that he was just kind of clinging to as, yeah, and that's also true, I am a Christian. It's like, no, he viewed faith in Christ as the centerpiece for the human condition and for healing from the human condition. And so anyway, that's an interesting thing to note whenever you read Notes from Underground or Crime and Punishment. And that's that certain things were cut that more explicitly pointed towards the necessity for Christianity in order to ground morality, in order to ground the redemption of both the man in Notes from Underground. His name's going to be the Underground Man, since you never hear his name. And then, of course, Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. So let me set up kind of the background of the book. I know that we've talked about this ad nauseum if you've been a avid follower of the podcast, but I've injected some new life into this prelude, into this background. So bear with me if you're a regular listener. Russia in the 19th century had become absolutely drowned with Western influence and culture to where many people felt out of place, isolated and rejected because they weren't up on the modern thinking. They hadn't read the right books. They didn't catch the modern perspectives, the trending clothes, the imported beliefs about religion, that sort of a thing. So with Russia's culture being largely imported, there were a lot of people who felt displaced, like they weren't enlightened men of conscience, as the Underground Man puts it. And I'm actually going to read you a quote from Dostoevsky. This is from his magazine called Time, which eventually got censored. The quote is from the February and March issues of the magazine in 1863. So that's just a year before he wrote Notes from Underground. Dostoevsky had actually visited Europe the year prior, and this is what he said about his visit. Quote, "Why, everything, unquestionably almost everything that we have of development, science, art, civic-mindedness, humanity, everything comes from there, from that same land of holy wonders. Why, our entire life, even from very childhood itself, has been set up along European lines," end quote. And when he says civic-mindedness, I'm pretty sure he means politics. We wouldn't say civic-mindedness anymore, but that's kind of what he means. What does it mean to be a good citizen? What are your civic duties? That's the idea. So Dostoevsky sees all this, and he sees that the imported culture from Europe into Russia is causing this cultural force that is making people feel isolated, like they are living in a land that is no longer their own. And there's not just a cultural force, it's a spiritual force. And it's making people feel destitute and purposeless and worthless, like they don't have a home, like they don't fit. And so there's this immediate jump from Orthodox Christianity, which was rampant in Russia, very dominating cultural force, and that is completely rejected in favor of the new European mindset, which is atheism, socialism, and utilitarianism. And these ideas just shatter the average person who was recently a peasant and who is just not able to keep up with the intellectual arguments being imported from the West, who have been battling these ideas since the beginning of the Enlightenment. And so many people now have thrown up their arms and gone, well, I guess I've been wrong. I guess I've been wrong about Christianity. My parents have been wrong, and their parents have been wrong, and really all my ancestors have been wrong. Whatever, fine. We've been wrong about God. We've been wrong about our origin. We've been wrong about our purpose. We've been wrong about right and wrong. We've been wrong about everything. And so the youth of Russia then pick up Marxism as a replacement. They say, well, we've been wrong, but you know what? Marxism fills that void. It answers the same questions that Christianity got wrong. We don't have to wait for heaven later. We can bring heaven to earth. We can dispel the notion of sin, because that's really just an economic problem due to oppressors and oppressed, and economic factors meant to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And we can live in a utopia if we can just organize our government in a way that the working class rules. And so Marxism really was the logical step after the rejection of Christianity. But Dostoyevsky saw that utilitarianism will never really bring any form of unity. It's a false unity. Because as soon as you don't fit into the program that the socialists have built, you're excluded and ultimately killed off, because it's not immoral to kill you off because you do not bring any utility to the good. The idea of utilitarianism, of course, as we talked about before, is morality is whatever produces the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, which sounds great unless you're not in that most in either case. If your actions are not bringing about the most amount of good for the most amount of people, or if you as a person do not contribute to the most amount of good for the most amount of people, well then by definition, it's not unethical to remove you. As a matter of fact, there's an ethical necessity to remove you. You become a cancer for the rest of the group. Maybe you're too old, or you're sick, or you have a disability, or maybe you have some really inconvenient beliefs that you just won't keep your mouth shut about. Then you become a problem. You are inconvenient for the group. You're not benefiting the rest of society. Your existence does not bring about the most possible good for the most possible people. And so off to the concentration camp you go. And it is socialists who invented the concentration camp. It was actually Lenin's invention. Let's just get all the people who are inconvenient and just put them in one spot. If they just shut up and let me run things for a second, they would see that things will be better. That's the unity that is obtained through socialism. That's how they obtain the unity. It's written right into their most original authors. There's a building in Europe that Dostoyevsky visited called the Crystal Palace. Perhaps you've seen it. Or at least you know what it is. It's a very large pyramid made of glass and cast iron. And it was considered a symbol of unity and strength in the new era of enlightenment. It was built in London in 1851 for the Great Exhibition. And Dostoyevsky visited this building, and in his visit to Europe, he saw it as a terrifying symbol, a representation of this false unity that was just a mirage. He called it the symbol of, quote, the full triumph of Baal, the ultimate organization of the anthill, end quote. So in this book, Notes from Underground, Dostoyevsky tells the story of a retired civil serviceman who is still fairly young, and he retired because a distant aristocratic relative died and left him a bunch of money. And he spends a lot of time at home trying to be a part of this new generation. He reads all the right books, and he tries to be an enlightened and developed, cultured person. He tries to be a part of the new unity that the Crystal Palace symbolizes. But he finds that it's all fake. and he starts actually thinking about what these writers are really saying and where their thoughts are going and the logical conclusion of their premises. And he begins to reject them full force. He understands these writers, even all the way back to the beginning of the Enlightenment. Rousseau, Schiller, Kant. He's read the French social romantics, including Victor Hugo, Eugene Sue, George Sand, and then also the utopian socialists, Francis Fourier, Henry Saint-Simon, these people who have been cranking out these ideas for a very long time. And he can't help but feel like these ideas are completely foreign. They're not authentic. They're fake. It's as if someone got this idea and then they carried it not to its logical conclusion, but just to the point where it's politically convenient to stop. And then they romanticize it and make it all ideal-like, and they use it in order to fuel their own political agendas to try to overthrow a monarchy. And so he sees this, and Dostoyevsky sets up this character who understands these ideas, and he argues that he understands them better than the people who are writing them. Except this character, he understands them as he's isolated from other people. And he brews on these ideas, and he writes this diary for weeks after retiring underground. Again, like I said, he was able to retire because a distant aristocratic family member died, and so he quit his job, and now he just is down here writing. And so the story is essentially his diary, and the first half is him monologuing about himself, his story, who he is, his ideas about life, his responses to the modern worldview. And then the second half of the book is his attempts to live out the modern worldview and the narrative of how his life has turned out, the utter absurdity and pain and brokenness of it all. And when I say this, I mean he realizes some of the existential ridiculousness of believing that God does not exist and all I am is an overgrown monkey and therefore I don't have any free will, but I have to have free will. Just look at me. These kinds of things. And so the underground man begins to refute the modern worldview by, number one, carrying the premises to their logical conclusion, and then number two, realizing that they're completely unlivable as a world philosophy, as a worldview. So I'm going to gloss over some of the existentialist themes in the latter half of the book, and I'm sure I'll come back around to that when I talk about existentialism more thoroughly. We're going to read some Jean-Paul Sartre and some Camus, and maybe even some Kierkegaard. We'll see. So when we come around to those things later in the podcast, when that'll be more relevant, hopefully I'll come back and visit Notes from Underground. But for now, I just want to slice the book nicely to talk about his view of human beings and why utopianism is fundamentally impossible in virtue of what the human being is actually like. And as the character's tragedy plays out, perhaps we'll discuss that at a different time. And so one thing you definitely need to know is that it is written specifically as a refutation of the young, naive socialists, the radical Marxists who were very popular revolutionary writers for the Russian Revolution. And the way Dostoyevsky attacks these naive socialists and the way he attacks their ideas is by saying utopianism is fundamentally impossible. Why? Because of the nature of a human being. And there are many different ways that he makes this case, right? You have the depravity of man, that human beings are incapable of performing, of being essentially a good person. So human beings, you cannot rely on mankind to do the right thing and to work for the benefit of everybody rather than just the benefit of themselves. There's obviously that argument, but there's another argument that Dostoyevsky makes, and we're going to get into it, but you need to understand that for Dostoyevsky, it wasn't just disembodied ideas that he was fighting against. It was specific writers who Dostoyevsky had an ongoing rivalry with. And there's one author specifically who Dostoyevsky quotes and mocks in Notes from Underground, and he has this ongoing feud and rivalry with this author. His name is Nikolai Chernyshevsky, and he was a very influential Russian socialist author. Chernyshevsky was actually the writer who influenced Lenin and caused him to identify as a socialist revolutionary. So we're talking about the guy who wrote the ideas that turned Lenin into a socialist. So you can't really underestimate the influence of Chernyshevsky's work on world history. And you also can't underestimate Chernyshevsky's work on Dostoyevsky. I mean, Chernyshevsky literally wrote books on what he called, quote, rational egoism and, quote, enlightened self-interest. And these premises are what build the utilitarian viewpoint, which Dostoevsky specifically responds to in Crime and Punishment, and also in Brothers Karamazov. But the idea is, if you try to think that rational egoism is going to lead to an enlightened society, this is what rational egoism and enlightened self-interest will get you. It will get you Raskolnikov. And so that's the entirety of Dostoevsky's writing career, is refuting Chernyshevsky point by point, basically. And in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky makes the specific argument that human beings are incapable of utopia because they don't actually want it. And that is going to come as the conclusion of what we're going to talk about here. So I want to make I want to skim a couple parts that really impacted me from Notes from Underground, that I think are really, really keen perceptions of what the human being is actually like. And then we'll finish strong with that conclusion, which I am sure is going to be really awesome. So hang with me. This is going to be good. So, okay. I mean, the book is only 150 pages. It's time to get into it. The book opens like this. He says, quote, "I am a sick man. I am a wicked man," end quote. And he tells the audience that he's feeling ill. Perhaps he has a liver disease, but he doesn't care. He is decaying physically, but it doesn't matter. He specifically doesn't go to a doctor just to spite himself. And you might initially think, well, that's kind of weird. Why would you not go to a doctor just to spite yourself? But come on. I think you can actually understand this if you think about it for a second. Have you ever wanted your life to go bad just for a second, just for a flash? You thought, man, wouldn't it be kind of nice if I was in a car accident and everybody could feel bad for me and I wouldn't have to go to work and I could just focus on recovering and lay in bed, and sure, it would hurt, but it'd be fine. It'd just be an alternate path that I could take, and it'd be all right. It would kind of be nice, be a little bit of a relief from some of my daily stresses. And so that's kind of where the underground man is. He says, man, my liver hurts. It's probably liver disease. Oh, well. So if you've ever had the impulse to punch a wall or, work out a little extra hard and just inflict a little bit of pain and be like, yeah, that's where this underground man is right now. He's saying, look, I reserve the right to be bitter and angry and be in pain and enjoy the pain. So he tells us that he used to work in a government office for a few decades before retiring at 40. And he was intentionally bad at his job. And he was spiteful and bitter and rude. And the reason is because he didn't take bribes. And so if you're a government employee and you don't take bribes, well, then you're entitled to be rude. How else are you going to indulge yourself? And again, I think we can kind of understand this. We can sympathize with this. If you've ever had a job in retail or food service, you'll have those days where it's just an exceptionally bad day. And sure, you don't have to be rude, but we can find little ways to express our anger. Maybe we pilfer food or pilfer time or refuse to do the littlest things that we're supposed to do. And then we take pleasure in it, That's the underground man, at least when he was employed. He said, I did the slightest little things in order to make sure that everyone who I interacted with had a slightly worse day than they really needed to have. And many of us behave that way. It's a little bit pathetic, and if you don't want to admit it to yourself, that's okay. I can't actually hear you. No one's with you while you're listening to this, probably. That's how most people listen to podcasts alone. And so you can just admit it to yourself quietly, or not. You know what? You're better than that. You're never that petty. Sure. Okay. Fine. But that's what the underground man is admitting. He's saying, I am the kind of guy who I didn't take bribes. I didn't let myself go that low. And so therefore I allowed myself to be a little bit rude. Okay, a lot rude. Another observation that the underground man makes is that people are very self-absorbed, and he is self-absorbed. and he has a higher opinion of himself than is really warranted, and everyone has a higher opinion of themselves than is really warranted. He says people are selfish and petty and indifferent to things that matter and bitter towards things that they're supposed to love. And we can constantly think about 10 different little simple things that if we would just stop doing, we would be better people and the world would be a little bit of a better place. But we kind of enjoy indulging in not doing those things that would make the world a better place and not fixing those areas in our lives that we really should have gotten around to fixing 10 years ago. But most people just completely ignore their flaws. They just are not honest with themselves. But, the Underground Man says, when you are honest with yourself and you let the floodgates open, then you jump to the other alternative, the other extreme. You jump to horrible self-loathing and self-pity, where you say that I'm just captured by my nature. I've always been this way. I'll never recover. I can't change. Human beings cannot fundamentally change themselves. And the Underground Man, as you can see, let me make this clear. The Underground Man isn't necessarily saying that this is true. It's something that you see in him as he's writing. You're reading the book and you're seeing how he says that everyone's arrogant and that he's arrogant and all decent people love just talking about themselves. But then he ends up going in this huge loop where he starts talking about how people can't change and how he is irreversibly corrupted and irredeemable and how he loves bouncing back and forth between waxing emotional repentance, and then he goes right back to where he was before in less than an hour. And he views himself as irreversibly corrupted and irredeemable. And so you as the reader can see the two states of man. Either the man who doesn't think about himself at all and doesn't recognize his own flaws, or the man who is so obsessed with his own flaws that he just gives up entirely and just condemns himself and says, oh, I'll never change, and he doesn't pursue any kind of actual redemption. That's another thing that's painful that I can absolutely relate to is it's easier to condemn yourself as someone who can never change. It's easier to just say, I'm always going to be this way. This is just the way that I am. And I guess I'm just going to have to put up with myself, rather than swallowing your pride and saying, okay, I messed up, but you know what? I'm going to do better. And instead of that resolute, I will never do that again, you just say, okay, one more day. Can I get through today? Another interesting observation that the Underground Man makes about mankind has to do with pain. He says that, of course, man is subjected to the laws of nature that they cannot control, that sometimes life just deals them a toothache. And congratulations, you're a human being and you can feel pain, and now you have a toothache. You have been determined by brain states and forces outside of your control, and now you're in incredible pain. And no one else can understand your pain or share it, nor do they really care that you're in pain fundamentally. And you're angry about this, and you can spit at Mother Earth, and you can spit at Mother Nature, and you can spit at God, but it's not going to change a thing because there's nothing you can do. You are completely powerless, and any attempts at alleviating your pain are going to be absolutely futile. And so, what are you going to do? Well, let me tell you what human beings do, says the Underground Man. Human beings moan and groan strategically in order for everyone else around them to share their pain. And of course, it's not really sharing their pain because it doesn't make them feel better. It only makes everybody around them feel worse. Because then they have to listen to the moans and the groans. But he reasons to himself, he says, well, I'm in pain. Why shouldn't you be in pain? Oh, I'm sorry. Are you annoyed by me being in pain? And so they can play the victim. And so human beings moan and they groan, even though they know it doesn't make them feel any better, but it gives them the satisfaction of knowing that everyone else around them either has to feel pity for them or feel angered and irritated by their moans and groans. And this somehow gives them some sort of satisfaction. We are so good at making a mountain out of a molehill and trying to get everyone around us to feel either annoyed or pity us. The Underground Man says that anybody with a conscience cannot possibly have the slightest respect for himself. And if you think about the kind of person you really are on the inside, you should lose all self-esteem immediately. And here's the main thing. This is the underground man's observation that really launches him into his most profound conclusion. Human beings are not the kind of creatures that want what's logical and good. Sometimes we want something to go wrong just for the thrill of having something go wrong. We do not fundamentally always desire the profitable and the reasonable and the good. We are essentially whimsical creatures, and when we get our mind fixed on something that we want, we are willing to dispense with anything in order to get that. We will choose the harmful, the stupid, the backwards, just for the sake of it, just so that we're not bound by the intelligent, by the noble. We'll jump into an affair that we know is not going to end well, just for the fleeting pleasure of the moment. We will fantasize about something going wrong for someone that we're supposedly proud of, because, well, maybe if they weren't doing so great, we would look a little bit better. We are fully capable of making really, really bad life choices just for the sake of it. And so here's a very powerful quote. Quote, "You see, reason, gentlemen, is a fine thing. That is unquestionable. But reason is only reason and satisfies only man's reasoning capacity, while wanting is a manifestation of the whole life, that is, the whole of human life, including reason and various little itches. And through our life in this manifestation often turns out to be a bit of trash. Still it is life, and not just the extraction of a square root. I, for example, quite naturally want to live so as to satisfy my whole capacity for living, and not so as to satisfy just my reasoning capacity alone, which is some 20th of my whole capacity for living. And so the human being is not fundamentally a rational human being. We have all sorts of little itches and desires and wantings, and we are going to pursue those things. And if it's not rational, we will completely eject reason just to have our way. We're driven by hunger and lust and attention and glory and self-pity and all kinds of things that do not make sense, that do not benefit the long-term goal. They do not push us towards the most amount of good for the most amount of people. And so this truth blossoms into a beautiful critique of socialism and utopianism. And the underground man says that even if you could arrange society to where there was no more poverty, no more pain, no more misery, do you really think that you would be happy? Do you think that people would strive for the good to bring about that reality? What if what people really want, what if our fundamental desire is to have struggle and bear it? What if we really want the strength to overcome our sufferings rather than not having any sufferings at all? Or if we find that we cannot do that, what we really want is for people to feel pity for us, and we want to wallow in our misery, in our woe. But what we definitely do not want is an easy, peachy life with no problems. We would get bored of that in 2 weeks. Here's another quote. This one's good. Quote, "Now I ask you, what can be expected of man as a being endowed with such strange qualities? Shower him with all earthly blessings, drown him in happiness completely, over his head, so that only bubbles pop up on the surface of happiness, as on water. Give him such economic satisfaction that he no longer has anything left to do at all except sleep and eat gingerbread and worry about the continuation of the species. And it is here, just here, that he, this man, out of sheer ingratitude, out of sheer lampoonery, will do something nasty. He will even risk his gingerbread and wish on purpose for the most pernicious nonsense, the most non-economical meaninglessness, solely in order to mix into all this positive good sense his own pernicious fantastical element. It is precisely his fantastic dreams, his most banal stupidity, that he will wish to keep hold of, with the sole purpose of confirming to himself, as if that were so very necessary, that human beings are still human beings, and not piano keys, which, though played upon with their own hands by the laws of nature themselves, are in danger of being played so much that outside the calendar it will be impossible to want anything. And more than that, even if it should indeed turn out that he is a piano key, if it were proved to him mathematically and by natural science, he would still not come to reason, but would do something contrary on purpose, solely out of the ingratitude alone, essentially to have his own way. And if he finds himself without means, he will invent destruction and chaos. He will invent all kinds of suffering and still have his own way. He will launch a curse upon the world, and since man alone is able to curse, that being his privilege, which chiefly distinguishes himself from other animals, he may achieve his end by the curse alone, that is, indeed, to satisfy himself that he is a man and not a piano key. And if you say that all this, the chaos and darkness and cursing, can also be calculated according to a little table, so that the mere possibility of a prior calculation will put a stop to it all, then reason will claim its own. Then he will deliberately go mad just for the occasion, so as to do without reason and still have his own way. End quote. And so he's saying, if you think you can categorize human beings and understand them, you're wrong. People will sooner destroy everything just to have what they want. Even if you gave them all of the food they ever wanted, all of the money they ever wanted, and all they had to do was eat it and sleep and, quote, busy themselves with the continuation of the species, end quote, they would throw it all away just for something interesting to happen. Do you know what happens to most people who win the lottery? They have lost all that money in a few years. They are completely ruined. Just think about it. What kind of person would you be if overnight you had all the money you ever dreamed of? Let me just ask you this. Do you think your relationships would get better or would they get worse? Do you think your pride would shrink or grow? Do you think the opportunities that you could have with that money would be mostly noble or mostly self-serving? Your soul would rot immediately. Or perhaps I should put it this way. The money would expose what kind of character you really have. Because if you have no money, then you can't really expose who you really are. And when people get money, they really do expose who they really are. And you don't even have to win the lottery to demonstrate this. So, for example, people with some serious addictions, I'm talking real drug addicts and serious alcoholics who are absolutely broke. The last thing they need is money. They do okay when they're living off of nothing. They survive. But as soon as that unemployment check comes, bam, they're in the ditch somewhere, stuffed up with every ounce of bad thing they could possibly get their hands on. And the reason is because human beings often prefer suffering to well-being. And if you think that's ridiculous, just ask yourself, what do you prefer? Cheap happiness, day after day? Or a meaningful struggle that engages you and challenges you and pushes you? Not so much that you're crushed, but just enough to where you can soldier on and have some dignity and feel like you're doing something and that you're going somewhere. Human beings are pack animals. We need a load to carry. We need goals to achieve. We need purpose and struggle. That's what gives us our happiness. And if you gave us all the cake in the world and nothing to do except busy ourselves with the continuation of the species, we would throw it away in an instant, because people do not fundamentally have an economic problem. We fundamentally have a vacuum of meaning. And that can only be solved, or let me put it this way, that can be solved with suffering, because it presents its own purpose, alleviating the suffering and struggling to overcome it with virtue. And that's why there's no magic number. There's no bottom line amount of money where, if only I can make that much amount of money, if only we could just have this universal basic income, if only I could just be at this level, then I would be happy. Wrong. Give a human being money, give him an unemployment check, and you're not going to get poets and painters who are satisfied and fulfilled and happy people. We need the work. We need the toil. It's our lot in life, because we are not fundamentally interested in an easy existence. We want a challenging existence that we can rise to meet and then overcome. And if we can't overcome it, we would rather have the pain and suffering and wallow in it rather than feel nothing at all. And that's why utopianism is fundamentally flawed. And I have an important quote for you, just to finish this off, to finish off the episode strong. It's a quote from Richard Pivier, who's a Russian translator, and he's a scholar, and he translates a lot of Dostoyevsky's works. And he has this to say about the genius of Dostoyevsky. Pivier said in an introduction to Notes from Underground, he said this, quote, "A direct line leads from the metaphysical naivety to murder. A direct line leads from the anti-unity of utilitarian aesthetics to the false unity of the Crystal Palace." And Dostoevsky perceived these relations more clearly than anyone else of his time. And this perception coincided with, and in fact constituted, the maturity of his genius. He recognized that his opposition to Chernyshevskian thought could not be a struggle for domination. That what was in question was the complex reality of the human being, the whole person, the thing itself, and that a true articulation of that reality could only come as the final gift of an artistic image. End quote. So you can see Dostoevsky's method for fighting socialism. That's what Pivier is talking about. How does he fight the new ideas? How does he struggle against the Chernyshevskians? He doesn't do it by counter-domination. He doesn't do it by screaming and shouting and writing a 50-page essay about how wrong they are, or writing a 2-hour lecture. He doesn't mob, or he doesn't form a mob or start a riot. He doesn't pass around things for voting polls, or he doesn't jump on a soapbox. He creates art. Dostoevsky fights the rise of atheism and nihilism and socialism and utopianism and totalitarianism with art. And I think that is a powerful message for us today. And as we see the influences and the trends towards directions that only lead to chaos and death, and some of the mistakes of the past that are threatening to resurface, we can learn from Dostoevsky. I know I, for example, consider myself hugely captivated by Dostoevsky's proclivity to use art to persuade. Because if we stoop down to shouting matches and fighting the culture war in the legislature and in Facebook flame wars, then we're playing a game of cultural domination. We're trying to manipulate people into seeing things the way we see it. And you cannot win the culture war with domination and subjugation. That's how the Marxists and the Chernyshevskians fight. That's not how real thinkers fight. Because human beings are more complex than that. an artistic image is required. So thank you very much for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast, and please tune in next week for even more literary goodness.